HOA Karen screamed my name from the porch while swinging a crowbar into my front door, like she was executing a warrant she never had. She didn't know the door she was hitting wasn't wood anymore, wasn't decorative, and wasn't something a neighborhood tyrant could bully into submission. 2 weeks earlier, I was standing in the rain at my father's military funeral, watching a folded flag pressed into my hands while taps echoed through my chest. I flew home exhausted, hollowed out, still wearing grief like a second skin. When I reached my house at 3 a.m, my key didn't fit. The lock was new, polished, deliberate, and absolutely not mine. There was no notice taped to the door, no emergency warning, no explanation waiting in my inbox. I stood there, soaked, holding my father's flag, locked out of the home he'd lived in for 25 years. I slept in my truck that night like a trespasser, parked on my own curb. HOA Karen did that. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? I didn't call a lawyer first, and I didn't beg the HOA board for mercy because I already understood exactly what kind of person I was dealing with. I'm a federal structural engineer, which means my entire career has been spent designing systems that are not allowed to fail under pressure, not allowed to bend to intimidation, and not allowed to break when someone gets emotional. When HOA Karen changed my locks while I was burying my father, she didn't just cross a line. She announced that she believed grief made people weak, and compliance could be forced when no one was watching. That assumption is what ended her. I didn't reinstall a lock or file a complaint or ask for a hearing. I replaced the entire door with a certified bank vault system designed to withstand sustained physical attack. $22,000 of composite steel, internal reinforcement, and biometric control, all permitted, all approved, and all completely legal. The first time HOA Karen's crowbar bounced off that door, it wasn't loud, it was humiliating. Metal rang against metal and lost. Her arm recoiled, her face tightened, and the realization hit her that this wasn't a house she could push around anymore. Neighbors started opening windows. Phones came out. Someone laughed. She kept swinging anyway because bullies don't know how to retreat once an audience forms. Channel 12's camera showed up just in time to capture her red blazer streaked with sweat and fury while she screamed about violations she couldn't enforce anymore. The door didn't dent, the frame didn't move, and her authority collapsed in real time. I want you to understand something very clearly before this goes any further, because this story doesn't start with a door, and it doesn't end with one either. HOA Karen didn't wake up one day and randomly decide to mess with me. She selected me the moment she realized I was alone, distracted, and emotionally compromised. That selection process is the same one she used on others, and it's the reason this escalated so fast and so publicly. When you're grieving, you follow rules you would normally question. When you're tired, you pay fines you would normally challenge. When you're trying to survive emotionally, you don't expect someone in a blazer with a clipboard to weaponize bylaws against you. HOA Karen depended on that. She depended on silence, embarrassment, and the idea that most people would rather comply quietly than fight openly. She didn't account for what happens when the person she targeted understands systems better than she understands intimidation. Standing there on the porch, crowbar in hand, she thought she was still in control because she was louder and angrier. She didn't realize the control had already left her the moment I stopped reacting emotionally and started responding structurally. Every swing of that crowbar was proof that she had nothing left except noise. The neighbors weren't filming me, they were filming her. The news crew wasn't there to document a renovation, they were there to record a meltdown. And while she was screaming about power she no longer had, I was standing behind a door she could never touch again, watching the first domino fall exactly the way I'd calculated it would. I never wanted to be the guy fighting an HOA, and that's not false humility or revisionist storytelling. It's a simple fact, grounded in how my life had been built long before HOA Karen ever learned my name. I'm 45 years old, and for more than 2 decades my work has revolved around designing structural systems for federal facilities that cannot afford mistakes, places where miscalculations don't result in fines or arguments, but investigations, hearings, and sometimes body counts. Nuclear containment structures, government buildings, critical infrastructure projects where precision isn't a preference, It's a survival requirement. I lived my professional life far away from petty authority, far away from neighborhood politics, and far away from people who confuse paperwork with power. That distance made me exactly the kind of target HOA Karen prefers. Competent enough to own something valuable, detached enough to believe rules are applied fairly, and busy enough not to question small abuses until they become habits. My father Frank was the opposite of complicated. He served his country, came home, bought a modest ranch house on a corner lot in Riverside Meadows, and lived there peacefully for 25 years without ever believing he was at war with his neighbors. The house smelled like Old Spice and coffee grounds, and every wall carried reminders of a life built on consistency rather than ambition. Photos of Navy buddies, folded flags, framed commendations that never bragged but always mattered. Out front sat the navy blue mailbox, painted by Frank himself years earlier. Not bright blue, not decorative, but the deep service color that matched his uniform and made him smile every time he checked the mail. It wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was a quiet tribute, the kind that doesn't ask permission because it doesn't think it needs to. When Frank died, the house became mine in paperwork long before it became mine emotionally. 3 weeks before the lock change, I inherited the property and moved in quietly, paying HOA dues on autopay, following every rule while sorting through the physical remains of a man who had raised me to believe order and fairness were non-negotiable. Riverside Meadows looked like every other middle-class Phoenix suburb. 200 homes, trimmed lawns, neighbors who waved but didn't pry. That surface normalcy is what hides people like HOA Karen best. She doesn't thrive in chaos. She thrives in places where everyone assumes someone else is watching the rules. By the time I arrived, she had already been HOA president for 8 years, long enough to forget she was elected, and long enough to believe the neighborhood was hers to manage, rather than serve. The early violations were small on purpose, a strategy I didn't recognize at the time because grief dulls pattern recognition. Grass clippings left visible for too long, a trash can placed inches beyond regulation, a faint oil stain from my truck. Each notice came with a $50 fine, and language that grew sharper every time. Not because the violations were serious, but because submission was being tested. I paid them without argument because at that point I wasn't fighting for territory. I was just trying to get through my days without exploding. That compliance wasn't weakness, it was grief management, and HOA Karen mistook it for permission. The mailbox ultimatum arrived 2 days before my father's funeral, a certified letter demanding the navy blue B repainted to an approved desert tone under a policy allegedly passed 6 months earlier. 6 months earlier was when Frank was already sick, missing meetings, and no longer in a position to argue with people who enjoy enforcement more than governance. I called HOA Karen directly, not to argue, but to explain, to give her the courtesy of context she would later prove she never deserved. I told her the mailbox honored my father's service, that it had been there for 15 years without complaint, and that I was burying him that weekend. She cut me off mid-sentence, mispronounced my name deliberately, and told me rules didn't care about death. That was the moment authority revealed itself not as structure, but as cruelty with paperwork. I hung up before grief turned into something irreversible, still believing at the time that reason might eventually reassert itself. The funeral was perfect. Military honors, flag ceremony, veterans standing in quiet formation, and for 3 days I lived inside memory and obligation rather than conflict. When I flew back to Phoenix on a red-eye through a desert thunderstorm, I was running on exhaustion and muscle memory, expecting the house to be a refuge where I could sit in my father's recliner and breathe. Instead, the key failed, the lock rejected me, and authority made itself physical. Standing in the rain at 3 a.m, locked out of my own home, I finally understood that this wasn't about community standards or color palettes. It was about someone who believed that authority was strongest when exercised against people who were already on their knees. That realization didn't make me angry immediately. It made me precise. Once you understand how HOA Karen operates, the lock change stops looking like an isolated act and starts looking like the natural escalation of a system that had been running unchecked for years. HOA Karen didn't rule Riverside Meadows alone. She ruled it through silence, procedural confusion, and people who preferred comfort over confrontation. On paper, there was a board, 5 members total, but in reality there was only her and the fear she cultivated. Brad, the nervous adjuster, existed to agree with her in meetings and provide the illusion of consensus. The other members were decorative, present enough to satisfy bylaws, absent enough to avoid responsibility. That structure allowed HOA Karen to speak in the plural while acting entirely in the singular, a classic abuse of authority that thrives when no one wants to be the first person to say something feels wrong. The violations I received weren't about enforcement. They were about conditioning. Each notice trained me to respond, to pay, to comply without discussion. The language grew more aggressive because escalation was the goal, not correction. She wanted to see how far she could push before resistance appeared. And every time I paid quietly, she learned that pressure worked. What she didn't know was that grief doesn't erase awareness. It just delays reaction. While she was stacking fines and sharpening her tone, I was subconsciously cataloging behavior, the way I do on job sites when something feels off but hasn't failed yet. The mailbox ultimatum wasn't about color compliance. It was about symbolic dominance. She chose the most personal object tied to my father because authority feels strongest when it forces someone to erase part of themselves to comply. Changing my locks was the moment abuse turned into occupation. That act required coordination, paperwork, and intent, none of which can be explained away as a misunderstanding. She authorized a locksmith under the false claim of emergency occupancy concerns, used HOA funds to pay for it, and never provided documentation because she assumed I wouldn't challenge it. That assumption came from experience. She had learned that most homeowners don't know property law, don't read governing documents, and don't want to risk being labeled difficult. Locking someone out at 3 in the morning while they're attending a funeral isn't just cruel, it's strategic. It creates humiliation, dependency, and urgency all at once, forcing the victim to scramble for shelter instead of clarity. Sleeping on my neighbor's couch that night wasn't just physically uncomfortable, it was psychologically intentional. HOA Karen wanted me disoriented, embarrassed, and grateful for any solution that restored access, even if it came with conditions. What she didn't understand is that humiliation works very differently on people who design systems for a living. When something fails under stress, we don't panic, we investigate. The next morning I didn't lash out or threaten, I traced the authority chain. I spoke to the locksmith, confirmed the lack of documentation, and learned exactly how casually HOA Karen had crossed into financial misuse. That wasn't just harassment, it was theft dressed up as governance. When I pulled the original HOA covenants and found the grandfather clause protecting my father's mailbox, the entire structure cracked open. The violations weren't just unfair, they were invalid. That meant the fines, the threats, and the lock change all existed outside legitimate authority. HOA Karen hadn't been enforcing rules, she had been inventing power. Driving to her real estate office wasn't confrontation, it was confirmation. The moment I saw 7 Riverside Meadows listings on her wall, the pattern completed itself. The HOA wasn't just a governing body, it was a hunting ground. Harassment created distress, distress created panic sales, and panic sales fed her business. The lock change was never meant to be temporary, it was meant to destabilize me long enough to make selling look like relief. When I placed the locksmith invoice and the original covenant on her desk, I wasn't accusing her. I was showing her that I could see the entire machine she thought was invisible. The reimbursement check she handed me wasn't a victory. It was an admission that she knew exactly what she had done. From that point forward, the abuse became sloppy because exposure makes bullies reckless. Threatening texts, taped violation notices, procedural mistakes that only happen when someone is rushing to reassert control. Each misstep added weight to a case she didn't know was being built. HOA, Karen's power, depended on homeowners believing she was inevitable, untouchable, and protected by process. The moment I stopped treating her like authority and started treating her like a failing system, that illusion began to collapse. She didn't know it yet, but the lock change that night didn't just displace me from my home, it displaced her from power. Once the emotional fog lifted, what remained was structure, and structure is something I know how to dismantle piece by piece without ever raising my voice. I didn't rush toward confrontation after leaving HOA Karen's office, because rushing is how people make mistakes, and mistakes are exactly what predators rely on to survive exposure. Instead, I started building a file, the same way I would approach a federal investigation or a structural failure analysis, assuming that every action had a cause, every cause had a pattern, and every pattern eventually revealed intent. The lock change wasn't the crime, it was the symptom, and I needed to understand how deep the infection went before touching anything that might collapse prematurely. The first call came from Janet Morrison, an elderly woman on Elm Street whose voice carried the kind of calm that only comes from someone who has already survived worse than intimidation. She didn't dramatize what happened to her, she simply stated facts. 18 months of escalating violations after her husband died, fines that made no sense, warnings that grew sharper, and a sudden suggestion that selling might be easier. When we met in the coffee shop and she listed half a dozen similar stories without hesitation, the system revealed itself fully. Every target was grieving, recently divorced, unemployed, or aging. Every property was a corner lot or premium placement. Every sale happened under pressure, and every buyer traced back to HOA Karen's real estate operation. That wasn't coincidence, it was methodology. From there, the documents started telling their own story. HOA financial records showed consulting fees paid to HOA Karen's company for services that were never defined and never visible. Emergency maintenance costs spiked in direct alignment with harassment campaigns against specific homeowners. It wasn't sloppy accounting, it was laundering authority through paperwork. The original HOA covenants confirmed what my instincts already knew, that the rules being enforced didn't match the rules that actually existed. Amendments were claimed, but never proven. Votes were referenced, but never recorded. Authority was being asserted without foundation, which meant everything rested on homeowners not checking. The deeper I went, the more the abuse exposed itself through carelessness. Threatening texts sent anonymously, but misspelled in the same distinctive way. Violation notices taped to doors without certified delivery. Board members quietly admitting they'd never approved half the actions taken in their name. The HOA management company's compliance officer went silent when I suggested a full audit. The kind of silence that only happens when professionals realize they've been unknowingly facilitating misconduct. Every new piece of information didn't escalate the conflict. It narrowed it, focusing pressure exactly where it belonged. The breakthrough came when city planning records showed that several properties acquired by HOA Karen were permitted for conversion into luxury rentals, a direct violation of the community's founding charter. That detail transformed the narrative from abuse into fraud. She wasn't just forcing sales. She was restructuring the neighborhood for profit while weaponizing HOA authority to eliminate resistance. At that point, I understood that stopping her quietly wouldn't be enough, because systems like this regenerate unless they're exposed publicly and dismantled completely. Proof alone doesn't end corruption, consequences do. That's when I decided to stop waiting for her next move and start designing it. I didn't need her to confess. I needed her to act the way she always did when threatened, with escalation, arrogance, and spectacle. I installed security lighting that complied with every city ordinance and illuminated nothing but my own property, knowing she wouldn't verify before reacting. When she showed up with a manufactured complaint and a fake inspector, the evidence wrote itself. The staged outrage, the coached testimony, the technical language planted in a neighbor's mouth, all of it collapsed under the simplest verification. And when documents spilled onto my porch revealing acquisition timelines and development phases labeled with chilling precision, the last illusion fell away. This wasn't harassment anymore. It was organized exploitation. By the time the timestamps on her fabricated evidence proved she had created violations specifically to frame me, the case stopped being theoretical. It was active, documented, and irreversible. The proof wasn't hidden in legal jargon or buried in spreadsheets anymore. It was visible to anyone willing to look. At that moment, I didn't feel anger or satisfaction. I felt certainty. HOA Karen had built her entire operation on the assumption that no one would ever connect the dots. She was wrong. And from that point forward, everything she did only made the picture clearer. The moment you decide to expose a system built on intimidation, you have to do it where it can't be quietly buried. And HOA Karen made that easy, by always choosing spectacle over restraint. I didn't announce what I was doing or threaten consequences because threats warn predators to hide. I let her believe she was still the one applying pressure, still the one escalating, still the one forcing reactions. The vault door installation wasn't scheduled for privacy or convenience. It was scheduled for visibility, and by Saturday morning the street looked like a low-stakes festival of curiosity. Neighbors drifted out under the pretense of errands, phones already in hand, because everyone sensed something was coming, even if they didn't know what it was yet. The steel door slid into place, with the quiet authority of something built correctly, and the silence it created was louder than any announcement I could have made. HOA Karen arrived right on schedule, not because she had been invited, but because she could never resist a public assertion of control. Her white Lexus rolled in, as if it owned the curb, her red blazer perfectly pressed, her posture confident enough to convince anyone who didn't know better that she was still in charge. Brad followed her like a shadow, and two unfamiliar men trailed behind carrying paperwork and a camera that tried too hard to look official. She didn't greet anyone or ask questions. She issued orders, demanded the installation stop, and waved documents she claimed represented emergency authority. I didn't argue with her claims because arguing legitimizes them. I simply presented permits, approvals, and city documentation, all of it boring, all of it irrefutable. That's when the first crack appeared, when a board member laughed out loud and pointed out that no emergency meeting had been called, and the treasurer confirmed no notices had ever been sent. Watching authority unravel in public is a strange experience because it doesn't collapse all at once. It sheds layers, and each layer exposes desperation underneath. HOA Karen pivoted to performance, pointing at the camera and declaring the presence of news media, attempting to turn the narrative into one of a selfish homeowner, destroying community standards. That move might have worked if the camera operator hadn't been someone I already recognized from the earlier fabrication, and if I hadn't already contacted the real investigative desk at Channel 12. When I put the call on speaker and a producer confirmed they were 15 minutes away, the shift was immediate. Her voice tightened, her movements became sharper, and the certainty she relied on evaporated into anger she couldn't control. The final blow came not from me, but from the security contractor stepping forward with information HOA Karen never expected to surface in daylight. A break-in at his warehouse, stolen project files, a police report already filed, and security footage reviewed. When he mentioned the vehicle identified in the footage, the street went quiet in a way that only happens when people collectively understand that something criminal has just been named. A white Lexus registered to HOA Karen. She denied it reflexively, then doubled down, attacking the vault door itself with her keys as if physical rage could restore authority. The sound of metal bending against reinforced steel was almost gentle compared to the realization spreading through the crowd that they were watching someone self-destruct. Police arrived before the news van, and when Channel 12 pulled up moments later, the scene had already transformed from dispute to evidence. HOA Karen tried to assert HOA business as a shield, but shields don't stop criminal investigations, and they certainly don't stop cameras. The handcuffs closed quietly, without ceremony, and that quiet carried more weight than any shout ever could. No one cheered, no one intervened. Phones kept recording, not because people wanted drama, but because they wanted proof that intimidation had finally failed. As HOA Karen was guided into the back of the patrol car, her red blazer wrinkled and her gaze unfocused, the vault door stood behind me unchanged, unmarked, and indifferent. In that moment, it wasn't just her authority that collapsed. It was the belief that she had ever been untouchable. Once the spectacle ended, and HOA Karen was removed from the street she thought she owned, the real work began, because collapse without follow-through is how predators reassemble themselves later under new names. I didn't celebrate, and I didn't relax. I shifted into execution mode, the same mode I use when a structure fails and everyone assumes the danger is over just because the noise stopped. This phase wasn't emotional, and it wasn't loud. It was methodical, deliberate, and unforgiving. Evidence was no longer theoretical, it was consolidated. Victims were no longer isolated, they were connected. The difference between outrage and accountability is documentation, and at this point the documentation was overwhelming. Homeowners who had been silent for years started reaching out quietly at first, then with confidence once they realized they weren't alone anymore. Voicemails appeared, emails were forwarded, bank statements surfaced, and timelines aligned in ways that made denial impossible. Patterns repeated with mechanical consistency. The same escalation curve, the same language, the same pressure points applied when someone was grieving or vulnerable. HOA Karen hadn't been creative, she'd been efficient, and efficiency leaves trails. Brad broke first, not dramatically, but thoroughly, handing over records he had kept out of fear she would eventually blame him. Financial transfers, internal communications, and transaction histories filled in gaps I hadn't even needed to speculate about. The story told itself once all the pieces were on the table. This wasn't retaliation in the emotional sense, it was consequence engineering. I didn't need revenge, I needed permanence. I coordinated with investigators, provided clean timelines, and explained the mechanics of how authority had been abused so that it could be prosecuted rather than argued away. The vault door, which some people still thought was the point of the story, faded into the background where it belonged. It had done its job by forcing a public failure, but now the system that created the failure was being dismantled quietly, professionally, and without shortcuts. HOA Karen's allies disappeared, not because they were threatened, but because evidence makes loyalty expensive. What struck me most during this phase wasn't satisfaction. It was how quickly fear evaporated once people saw competence applied to abuse. The same neighbors who once avoided eye contact started asking questions, comparing notes, and realizing how often they'd been nudged into compliance without realizing why. Authority didn't transfer to me, it dissolved entirely, replaced by transparency and process that didn't rely on intimidation to function. That's what expert retaliation looks like when done correctly. No shouting, no grandstanding, no emotional payoff. Just a system being taken apart piece by piece until nothing remains that can hurt anyone again. HOA Karen didn't lose because I was louder or angrier. She lost because she tried to bully someone who understands how to make failure final. 6 months later, nothing dramatic happened, and that was the point. The street didn't celebrate an anniversary. No plaques were installed, and no one gathered to retell what had happened because real victories don't need maintenance. The house stood exactly where it always had, unchanged except for the door that blended so well into the facade that visitors stopped noticing it after the first week. There were no new notices in the mailbox, no certified letters, no threats disguised as policy reminders. The silence wasn't temporary or tense, it was settled, the kind of quiet that only arrives after something poisonous has been fully removed. HOA Karen's name didn't circulate anymore, not in gossip, not in meetings, not even as a warning. She became administratively irrelevant, which for someone who lived on control was a deeper erasure than anger ever could be. The mailbox stayed navy blue, not because it won a fight, not because it became a symbol, but because it never needed permission in the first place. It weathered the same sun and dust it always had, collecting ordinary mail without drawing attention. That detail mattered more than any headline because it represented continuity, the restoration of something that never should have been challenged. Neighbors walked past without slowing down, without staring at the door, without whispering. They remembered what happened, but they didn't need to relive it. The absence of enforcement theater was the most visible change. No clipboards, no drive-by inspections, no sudden policy updates quietly slid under doors. Governance returned to what it was supposed to be: boring, limited, and unremarkable. The legal process moved forward without my involvement beyond documentation. Investigators don't need commentary once the structure is exposed. They just need facts. HOA Karen didn't get a platform to explain herself. She got paperwork. Her real estate listings vanished from the neighborhood, replaced by court filings that no one bothered to read aloud. The board dissolved and reformed under rules that required transparency instead of obedience. People who had once felt watched stopped lowering their voices in their own driveways. The neighborhood didn't become closer. It became normal, and that normalcy was the clearest sign that intimidation was gone. I didn't give interviews after the first wave passed, and I didn't offer advice publicly because the lesson wasn't about doors or engineering. It was about what happens when someone mistakes compliance for consent and silence for weakness. The vault door wasn't a flex. It was a boundary rendered in steel, and once that boundary existed, everything else followed naturally. Power didn't shift to me, it evaporated from her. That distinction is important because power taken can be contested, but power removed leaves nothing to fight over. On quiet evenings, I still check the mail without rushing. No tension, no anticipation, no background calculation about what rule might be weaponized next. The house doesn't feel defended, it feels owned. That difference is subtle but permanent. HOA Karen never tried to assert control on that street again. No one replaced her with the same appetite. No one needed to. The lesson had already been delivered, and it didn't need repeating. The door stays closed when it should, opens when it should, and remains indifferent to anyone who thinks authority is something you can swing at until it gives way.